Hi, everyone. Ed Bixby here from the Global Green Burial Alliance, and this is Spotlight Now. Today, I'm here with Michelle Acciavatti of Roxbury, Vermont, for Vermont Forest Cemetery. Michelle is a death worker, a storyteller, a mother. She has trained as a funeral director, an advanced care planner, a death doula, an educator, a home funeral and pregnancy loss guide, a natural burial advocate and educator, a master naturalist, a writer, a neuroscientist, and an ethicist. In 2016, she created Green Mountain Funeral Alternatives to help people preparing for the end of life, designing funeral services, caring for their own dead, and exploring natural burial options. In 2023, she founded Vermont Forest Cemetery, the first natural burial ground in the state. She is a founding member of the Collective for Radical Death Studies and a board member emeritus of the National Home Funeral Alliance. So, welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Good morning.
It's great to have you. And you guys are doing some great work up there in the Green Mountain State. So, we're excited to introduce you to our community. Uh, to start it off, what inspired the creation of Vermont Forest Cemetery? Is there a particular moment when you knew this was something you had to bring to the state of Vermont?
There is actually, it's interesting. I was just reflecting on this. So it's been 9 years. So next year will be 10 years since we worked to fully legalize natural burial in Vermont. So when we moved to Vermont, my family moved to Vermont in 2014. There was a movement to legalize natural burial grounds because the definitions of cemeteries in Vermont really were very strict in terms of fencing and mowing and weren't in any way consistent with what you would want for a natural burial area. And so a group of people had worked to change that law, but they left a minimum burial depth of 5 feet. And so I spent 2016 going back to the State House and talking to the legislators and saying, well, hey, if we're really going to do this, we actually have to change the burial depth, which you can imagine, I mean, makes one really popular. The best time to talk to your legislator is at lunch. And everybody loves talking about death and decomposition while they're eating a sandwich. So and it's interesting. So this is, I knew about you and your work, but one of the documentaries that I used to teach people about what natural burial meant and why it was so important was Stillman Town. So this is a fun moment for me. But in 2017, the burial depth was changed, and I actually went back to working in death care, working with people at the funeral home and trying to teach people about laying out and caring for their own dead. And I just thought someone else would start the cemetery. I have no experience with anything cemetery operations related. And then I was working in a conventional funeral home when the pandemic happened. And one of the things that had been frustrating to me up until that point was I had thought that if I worked in a more conventional funeral home but was bringing these more alternative death care ideas, I would help people have more meaningful experiences with what happened after somebody died. And when you're working in a conventional funeral home, most of the time people are coming in just to do what they've always done. It's not really the right moment to say, what if you did something completely different? Except for with the pandemic, we had to do things completely differently because, we had gathering restrictions. We could no longer have people coming in and having just big traditional wakes or church services. And so, in the couple of years since natural burial had been fully legalized, some of the local cemeteries had created natural burial areas. And so I was able to say to people, hey, if you had a natural burial, people could gather outside and you could, they weren't there to support you through the dying process. They can't come and they can't come to this wake with you, but you could create this whole ceremony at the graveside and you could all work together to bury your loved one. And it could be a really impactful way to experience grief in these new situations. And a lot of people were really into that. And they created these just incredibly moving experiences, where they'd invite people that could play music and they'd say, well, this person has kids that could help with the shoveling. And they became these collaborative and really meaningful, personalized is a word that gets thrown around a lot in the death industry, but these were really from people's hearts in a new way. And I thought that it would be, it's selfish. I didn't want to be buried in one of these local cemeteries. I wanted to be buried out in the woods, and nobody had started the burial ground. And so I thought, okay, maybe that's what's next for me. And so I left the funeral home that I was working with in the summer of 2020 and started the search to start a forest cemetery. Not really knowing what I was truly getting into. But yeah, that's how it all began.
Well, that's a beautiful way for it to start. And what's interesting, and I always mention it, is that all of us, our community, really all kind of got into this profession not by choice. It was like something that just kind of led us down a path, and kind of was meant to be. So kudos to you for all the good work that you've done and helping people and creating a space like this. And, I've been to Vermont, spent lots of time in Vermont. It's a beautiful state. For our viewers, for the ones who haven't been there, if you could paint a little picture of the property, how large is the space and do you have any feature areas like, give a little information concerning the location and what they might expect if they were to visit.
Yeah. So we're in the geographic center of Vermont. So we're at the kind of at the base of the Green Mountains. So the Green Mountains run up the center of the state. And it's a pretty traditional upland forest in Vermont. When Vermont was settled by the colonial settlers, it was almost completely logged. And so this is very much a teenage forest because after land was logged 200 years ago, and then it was farmed, and then it was abandoned, and some trees grew up, and then it was logged again. We actually bought it from a logging company. So what we have are two very distinct areas because the logging company we bought the land from had planted almost 300 acres of Norway spruce, and intending to harvest those for paper products, I think. And what they found was Norway spruce don't regenerate well in Vermont. And so it was actually worth more for them to sell the land than log it. And so we're a subdivision of the 300 acres of that spruce plantation. So we have about 7 acres of Norway spruce. And then, so we're on a downward slope, and then the rest of that turns into kind of this teenage upland forest. It's a mixture of mainly red and sugar maples. There's some yellow birch and some white birch and some beech and ash trees. And then there's an area that had been a sheepfold. So there were sheep there, and there are some almost 100-year-old white pine that tower up in that area. And then the more downslope you go, it was harder and harder to log. So we get back to a little bit more traditional species structure where there's some hemlock that start to show up at the bottom. And it's 56 point, a little bit over 56 acres of land, and it's cut almost in half by the northernmost headwaters of the White River, which is a river that runs through Vermont all the way down to Connecticut. And so the third branch of the White River runs through the property. So not all of it is buriable. There are slopes that are too steep. There's areas that are too close to the river to meet the statutory siting guidelines for a cemetery. So we have about 30, we imagine, expect buriable acres. Roxbury is a really well-named town. The soil is really rocky. So in addition to making sure we're reasonable distance from trees and not disrupting root structures when we dig, we're also occasionally contending with hitting ledge, at a bit more shallow depth than we can bury and things like that. So that's why, we're hedging with the variable acres because it's hard to tell sometimes where we can bury and where we cannot. What we have done is our driving question at the cemetery is if you're going to give your body back to this land when you die in death, what can it offer you in life? Roxbury, my joke is it's in the center of the state, which means it's far from everything. It's a community of about 600 people. So there's a lot of people that have never been to Roxbury, never been to this part of the state. And so we try to do things to make it meaningful to people so that they can have a relationship with it in life. And so our mission, in addition to burial, includes conservation, but also art, learning, and community. And so along the arts direction, we've created a forest labyrinth. So in the center of that white pine grove, there was a blowdown, and I just saw a mess, and my husband saw a labyrinth. And so he started pulling out logs from the blowdown and laid out this gorgeous walking labyrinth made of logs. And we have a little wind phone and a remembrance grove that's there for people. We've been talking to some local artists about coming in and doing place-based art installations. We've built a small stage and have a number of musicians that come and will play right outside that labyrinth area. And the learning part, we have people that come and are interested in what is the science of natural burial. And also the land has these interesting stone mounds that are built on them. Who built the mounds? What are they for? What is we're interested in the both the colonial settler history of the land and the the earlier history of the land. And we've got people that are interested in the bird populations and things like that. So we have little areas where people can kind of come and immerse themselves in the life that's in the cemetery. And the other thing that we do is, if you come to visit, we're working on creating kind of an interactive guide so that when you come and you come to a gravesite, if the family wants to participate in this project, you can actually have um, an audio and a visual file of, pictures of that person and their stories and audio stories. When we give tours of the cemetery, one thing I say is that, these people, the legacy of their body lives on in the forest, right? Their molecules are actually become a part of that forest. But I want their stories to persist as well. And so everybody that gives tours at our cemeteries learns the stories of people. And again, with family permission. But if you come for a tour, yes, you can ask all sorts of questions about natural burial, but I'm also going to tell you that, oh, over here at this gravesite is this woman, and and when she was dying, she told me that she didn't want a marker because every tree in the forest would be her marker, and and she started the first women's shelter in the state to help women suffering from domestic violence, right? So all of this is incorporated in the forest, so I want it to feel like a place where it's a place for living. It's not a place just to come when you have to bury somebody or you want to remember somebody that's buried there. So I think that that's sort of the characteristics and the feel and what to expect when you come.
Well, it sounds absolutely magnificent. I mean, it's so beautiful. Vermont is such a beautiful state. And I mean, you hit the nail on the head. The experience really is, for the loved ones, for the community to come and embrace this space to respect not only the history, but, the individuals who were buried there. And for the people who've chosen it, I love the idea that you tell those stories because I do the same, and that's what really captures the hearts because you're there to celebrate a life that was lived, and that's what makes it so wonderful to return is because it feels like a happy place. You remember the good times. You don't allow the passing of a loved one to be the defining moment of a life that was lived. So it sounds to me like you guys are really doing some wonderful work. And I mean, you come to this work with some professional experience in the funeral and death care space. And I'm sure that's how the background shaped the way you envisioned and built the forest cemetery. Would you agree? Was it some of what you had done in the past that brought you to the decisions you made with the design?
I think so. I think, it's interesting. I think that there's a lot of people that, that I've come to know in doing this work because, because like I said, I knew nothing about it, right? So basically my attitude is teach me what I need to know. So, visiting various other natural burial grounds, talking to operators, the people up at Green Springs were just incredibly welcoming and I learned so much from them in particular. But also local foresters and everything, teaching what is a forest? How do we, when I got my master naturalist training and all of this, but my background isn't in conservation. It's not in ecology. My background's in neuroscience and then I went into death work. And so I think that I approach the balance between the needs and the mourners slightly differently. For me, my understanding of the way the forest and the ecosystem works is that it can adapt to almost anything, right? And so conservation goals and protecting the forest are incredibly important to us, but making sure that anybody of any physical ability can move around our cemetery is important, even though that means we don't have paved paths, but we do have some, fairly well engineered paths so that if you need to use a wheelchair or a stroller with an infant or somebody with, needs a walker to move around, that they can move around the cemetery as well is important to us. I know that there are cemeteries that are really, really strict and will check tags when bodies come in and making sure that there's nothing polyester going into the ground. And I can't imagine that, as somebody that's coming to this from caring for people, and walking families through that death experience, having somebody go through all of that, dress somebody and bring them to the cemetery and say, I'm sorry, they've got plastic buttons on a polyester shirt. You're going to have to go home and change them. I couldn't do that. And I rationalize that a little bit by thinking that, again, this land was logged, it was farmed, it was hayed, it was abandoned. There's probably tractors that are buried in the land. There's
Mhm.
already plastic in every inch of soil. And so every burial is an opportunity to do better, yes. And the entire forest ecosystem is benefiting from this. We are giving the forest medicine. But most of all, what we're doing is we're getting people to come into relationship with this piece of land and with the ideas of conservation so that even if somebody buries somebody, for example, a gentleman built his wife a casket. It was her wish. It was what he wanted to do for her. This is the way that he could love her and feel good about saying goodbye to her body in our forest. He built it out of 3-inch solid maple. It is not a softwood. And it was gorgeous. I mean, I would put this in my kitchen as a cabinet. I mean, it was absolutely beautiful, but it was also about 3 feet tall. I mean, this is not making it easy for the forest to take her body back. But it was his act of love, and there was no way I was going to tell him that he needed to build a different casket, right? So, for me, it's just this idea that now when he and his daughter and their friends come to this land, they're really invested in the health and the well-being of the land. And they ask us, what are you doing? Hey, that tree over there looks sick or thing, right? And they're invested in it in a way that they wouldn't be if it was just a park or a place where they'd scattered her ashes or something like that. And so even though that particular gravesite isn't doing the best for the forest, it's captured somebody's heart, mind, and imagination in a new way, and they're going to live their lives slightly differently and relate to land slightly differently. And not just at our forest. I tell everybody that comes at the end of the burial, I do a dismissal. And one of the things that I say is that even if you never come back here, that same mycelial network that is returning their bodies to these trees extends throughout North America. And so no matter where you go, when you put your hands in the soil, you are communing with the process of your loved one's life continuing here in this forest. And so my hope is that even if it's just in somebody's, you know, backyard garden, that they're understanding that we have such an impact on this planet and that we can do different and make better choices on how we relate to the planet, both with what we do with our bodies when we die, but with our everyday choices. And so I would rather have people have that sacred relationship than make every single burial as perfect as it could be from an environmental or a conservation standpoint.
No, I can absolutely appreciate everything you've just said because my experience has been the same. And, ultimately, we're there to care for the families. And we are changing the thought processes of people when it comes to, they may not be environmentalists per se at the moment, but, you're changing. It's like planting a seed.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, the way we've always operated, and it sounds like it's very similar to you, is that you have to have faith in your families. They know the requirements, they know what they're supposed to do. And I would say that generally, probably the majority, if not all, they stay within those limits. So I think you're
They
doing
do their
great work.
best. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really about that moment, and that's really what's changing the whole face of the funeral industry itself. With offering people this opportunity. So I love your how you process it and how you're looking and caring for the families in that way. And I'm sure it's quite an experience. So for our viewers, if a family were to have a service, what might that look like when they arrive at Vermont Forest Cemetery?
So for me, one of the things that I really learned when I was working in the conventional funeral home and watching people have these mourning experiences that just didn't seem to meet their mourning needs at all, right? People that would come in and say, well, when dad died, mom had a mass. So now that mom's died, I guess we should have a mass for her. And I would say, are you Catholic? And they would say, well, no, but I guess it's what mom would have wanted. And they sit through this religious service and then they go home. And it's the same with laying out and caring for the dead too, where, when I was working as a funeral director and I take somebody away and they come back and they tell me some information and they never see the person again, right? There's lots of things that I kind of looked at and I just said, is this really meeting people's experience? And one of the things that I would see is that grief is an emotion that really it demands action. Right? When somebody dies, we go into this state of shock, even when it's completely expected, right? Because someone's entire physical existence has come to its end. And how do you comprehend that? And you can't think your way through it. You have to experience your way through it. So whether that's touching the body of your loved one, or the whole way we've designed the experience at the cemetery is to make it as hands-on, as participatory as people's abilities allow them to do. So what we ask is that every family have at least 4 people that can assist with carrying the body to the gravesite, lowering it, and helping fill the grave. And if they don't, we have a core of volunteers that can step in and support that and support the family in that way. But the idea is that whether the family or funeral director is bringing the body to the cemetery, they will park in one of our parking lots, the whatever's closest to the gravesite that they've selected. And then we use straps, whether it's a casket or a body in a willow basket or a shroud on a backboard. And my husband we're a very family-oriented business at this point. So my husband is the sexton of the cemetery, and he'll walk the pallbearers through the path to the graveside and how they're gonna rest the body. We place boards over the top of the grave so they can rest the body there. And he walks them through that process. And then when they're ready, the family does that. So they carry the body to the gravesite themselves. We have a bench for long carries, so if they need to rest, they can. And we encourage families to do that. And sometimes they begin to create ceremony from that moment. There's people that have come with music, or want to do the walk in silence, or and sometimes they're just sort of feeling their way into it at that point. And then they get the body settled at the gravesite, and they have the opportunity to have whatever ceremony they want. And we've had Muslim, Catholic, um, a couple of Jewish ceremonies. We've had military funeral honors at this point. We've had a pagan ceremony. We've had all sorts of, Quaker, various other Christian denominations, and then just completely freestyled. We've had complete silence. So this and I help facilitate and lead them sometimes for families where I'll lead remarks, but it's this wonderful, and again this organic experience that seems to come from people. And most of it all involves some form of storytelling. And what I tell people to think about at that moment is this isn't the time to sum up someone's entire life. This is not the place for the formal eulogy. This is the part to really celebrate the fact that this is the last time you'll be with their body. We're giving their body back to the forest. They don't need it anymore, and the forest does. So the ceremony is about marking that transition and why that's meaningful for them. Because there's a lot of people that come to this that are like, this is what they wanted. I don't really know, but we're just here. We're gonna do it. We're gonna do it for her. We're gonna do it for him. And and they're just trying. They've got that willingness. They've just got that gumption. They're gonna go with it. They're gonna figure it out. And they do. And so the ceremonies sometimes are a little bit more stilted and formal. And then it comes time to the lowering. And that's always, I mean, that's just such a sacred moment, right? When you're actually lowering the body into the earth and that period. So we have them stand on the side of the grave. Our graves are 3.5 feet deep, and hand over hand, they let the straps down. We line the bottom of the grave with boughs, so the body kind of nestles into those boughs, and they pull the straps up. And then one thing that I've learned is we put a layer of boughs over the top of the body because that thunk of soil hitting a casket can be really jarring for people because it's just not something that most people have experienced. And if somebody's in a shroud, there's always just such an unwillingness to put any soil over the face. And so if the body's curtained in boughs, it both promotes oxygen flow and, it's good from a scientific reason, but emotionally, I think it can be easier. And then what we find is once the shovels come out and people start filling, there's this, and maybe you have this experience too, right? There's this whole change in mood. Like there's this lightness once the work starts and people start telling jokes and stories, or the songs come back and they're singing again. And they work together. And almost every family that we've worked with has completed the filling of the grave. We have volunteers that step in and help, but people will just keep working as much as they can. And some have just said, step away. We're going to do all of this ourselves, and we're just there to bear witness to the work that they do. But at the end, when that grave is mounded over and we put one layer of pine boughs over, and people sometimes have flowers, and they lay that site and they step back, and the thing that we hear almost every time is, that was perfect. And and you just know you've done something right when that's the way people feel, especially the ones that come in going like, I don't know what I'm here for.
Well, no, I mean that's a beautiful description, and I can relate, being in this industry like yourself, but for the viewers, we, Michelle and myself, we have this distinct honor, probably that many cemeterians don't have, that because natural burial is kind of, it belongs to the world, to everyone, to every living human being, that we've served every probable race, religion, sexuality, you name it, we've done it. And at the end of the day, people cannot get along in life, but somehow find this space with acceptance of death, that they're not too worried about where they're at or who they're next to, because we all come from the same place. So there's like a level of tolerance, and
Yeah.
I love your description, because it really is absolutely true. People will come, and because people are only afraid of what they don't understand, right? So once they're introduced to it, it's within our DNA. We've done it since the dawn of time. So that's why I think it feels so good. It's really strange. You've unlocked this little box in people's brain with the ability to do this. So thank you for that. And I'm sure the viewers really enjoyed that description because it was beautiful. And, I mean, you guys are up in Vermont, and I'm sure that you deal with people outside of your area, but I'm sure you deal with your community as well, meaning, for services and things like that. How has the community responded since you've opened? Is there anything that surprised you about how the people have engaged with your space or the idea of natural burial?
I mean, I think I had an advantage because I was part of the legalization of natural burial, that process, and because I had been traveling around the state offering, doing education and advocacy, right? So I think that I had really begun to create a community that was hungry for this, that was inspired by this, that was curious about what this meant. And, and like you said, this isn't, I think that there's a a line of thinking where, this is a green thing, right? And so this is only for people that drive electric cars and are vegan and all of this. And right, this is Vermont. We have people that are deeply connected to the environment that drive giant diesel trucks and, and hunt and eat their own, food that they create themselves. So I think that I've always really tried to make this, it's why I use natural burial in part because of green, but I've tried to make this as inclusive and open as possible. And so I think one of the not surprising but incredibly rewarding things has been seeing the demographic makeup of the people that come to the cemetery, the vehicles that come into the parking lot, and sometimes the range of vehicles at one service of people that come to these things. I think, and I was expecting a lot of objections, and maybe I did such a great job about educating people that this was less, about will animals, dig up the dead? Are we going to contaminate the groundwater? How are you going to do this work in winter? Those are the things I was anticipating. We've had questions like, what if a tree blows down and it catapults the body up out of the air and flings it onto the windshield of a car driving down the road? See, that was not the type of question I was anticipating having to answer from the public. And what do you say? What do you say to something like that? I mean, first, okay, well, you don't bury that close to a tree because you don't want to cut that many roots when you're digging. You don't want to damage the tree or the forest that way. But I mean, it's just at some point, all you can say is, well, I guess if that happened, I would call the family and say, do you want to come back for the reburial? I mean, it's just um, so some and then just there's just some people where the objection, it just sort of it feels like it's so fear based, that I wouldn't want to live next to you. Can you imagine the smells, things like that. And that's been disappointing, but I think the really the most rewarding thing has been the people that come and the call for when we say we need volunteers, the people that show up. We worked with a family where the person died here, but his family was on the West Coast and they weren't sure they were going to come to the burial. And we put it out. We said, look, there's not going to be anybody. Can you come both to help and to bear witness? And we had, over a dozen people show up to be there. And the family ended up making it last minute. We didn't know they were coming. They didn't tell us, but but when they showed up, this small family, all of a sudden there was a forest full of people there to support and hold them. Um, and I think the best thing has been the reaction of kids. We had the incredible privilege of a group of documentary filmmakers from Ithaca College followed the opening of the cemetery and wove our story into a documentary that they were making about natural burial. So they captured this moment at our first burial where the man's grandsons were there. And he was in a shroud and he's getting carried past his grandson to the gravesite by his father and his uncles and laid down on the grave. And the little boy looks at me and he goes, "Is that Grandpa?" And I said, "Yeah." And his dad's settling the body at the grave and he goes, "Can I touch him?" And his dad looks up and goes, "No." And I said, and I looked at him, I said, if you're okay with it, really, he can. It's okay. And so this little boy walked over and I knelt down on one side of the body and he knelt down on the other and he kind of reached out and kind of pokes at it. And he looks at me and goes, "That's different." And he picked up a stick and starts, I don't know, playing swords or something, just swinging the stick around. Because that's right. They're so present and they're so matter of fact and they don't have all of our grown-up fears and concerns about death. But what that moment created was one of his uncles, as soon as they'd laid his the body down, had stepped really far away from the grave. And this uncle watched his little nephew come and touch the body, and he came over, stood close to his father, and after a moment he knelt down and he reached out and he put his hand on his father's heart, and he stayed that way for the entire ceremony. And and I think there's so many people out there that think we need to separate kids from death for all sorts of reasons. But I think, first of all, they understand it in a way that we just can't. And having them there allows us to step back into that ability to be present. And we've just had so many magical moments. We keep little kid-sized shovels And sometimes, they're our hardest workers. On hot days, they run around with fans and spritzing people with water and fans. And, they find things to do or they sing. And it's just, it brings something. And I'm raising my son at the cemetery. I think it brings something back where it's just that reminder again of this person's body will continue as life in the forest. And these children that are here are going to continue and they're going to grow up with these memories. And hopefully they're going to be growing up interacting with this space. And it's just this magic that is created when you can tangibly experience that with a child at the graveside. So that's been the thing I really didn't expect was how beautiful and inspiring that would be of having kids as a part of it.
Absolutely. And I think what the viewers would learn from what you've just shared is that, these experiences, funny enough, bring you closer to death in a more meaningful way. You become less fearful of it. You become more cognizant to the cycle of life and the loved ones that you leave behind. And, of course, unfortunately, the world we live in today with things like, horror movies and ridiculous stuff that stigmatized, what we do. But the children are the real answer to the future, and if they're not fearful of death, I think you can live a greater life. I think far too many people restrict themselves, based upon some of those things. And I think if you can accept that you're here today and you could be gone tomorrow, but you're all right with that, you'll live a more carefree life. I think that's my opinion. But
Yeah, there's a
yeah,
line in our documentary that Michelle Mentor, who's someone that you've also interviewed at Green Springs, and she says, if we could remember that there isn't always a tomorrow, we would have such a potential to live such more full lives. And it's just a line where every time, she says that in the documentary, I look out at the audience and there's people are nodding and tears are streaming down people's faces because it's so true. But the world we live in makes it so easy to either forget that or to just want to shove it down and never interact with that thought at all. And
well,
so I think it's the being able to come into connection with that is really important.
absolutely. So, I mean, you folks are doing some wonderful work, and I'm really glad we're able to interview you because I think you will inspire others. Because there's probably many people who would like to be doing what you're doing, but they don't know where their place is in this. And the funny thing is, everybody that's listening, neither did we. We just
We
kind of,
didn't know we didn't know what we were
yeah,
doing.
we just kind of fell into it, and then these experiences is what made us passionate about what we do. So, I mean, at this point, looking ahead, how do you hope Vermont Forest Cemetery will grow or evolve over time? And what legacy do you hope it leaves for both the families and the land itself?
I mean, my hope is that every community in Vermont will create something like this for themselves. It makes me sad that we're the only cemetery in Vermont, but it's so far and there's more and we're constantly reaching out and talking to people. And I do think, it's such a good point because there's so many people that are like, "Oh, we want to do this," but they think you have to find the absolutely perfect piece of land or you've got to, I don't know, go and and I'm sorry, pay lots of money to take a course on how to create a cemetery and they don't have that kind of money and it's just like talk to people. We're here. We're willing to share what we know. We want to help. I invite people all the time, come to a burial, come work with us, just come work alongside us and figure it out. Find your team, build your community. So my hope is that, by doing that work, by making it accessible to people, by saying come and learn through doing, that more people will feel like, okay, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I know I can call, call Michelle and Paul at any point, and when we're just going to try that because if we can have, because again, we're not physically close to everybody. I think that there's a community aspect of cemeteries. Sometimes people choose the local hybrid option because all their friends are there, or because it's easier for their kids to visit. Right. And so I think making sure people have something that really speaks to them, that inspires this relationship with the land, with thinking about living and dying in different ways, but in their own community is so important. So that's really what I hope is that the future of Vermont Forest Cemetery is sure, we can always say we're the first, but eventually we'll just be one of many. And that by being the first, what will inspire people to think about is, to how do these spaces speak beyond burial and making sure that they continue being places that offer people meaningful engagement during life. And I mean, and ultimately, I hope that that's what the legacy of the cemetery is. We didn't put our names in it. I hope someday, I mean, I want to be buried there. My family, right now the plan is we'll all be buried there. My son is only one, so who knows where he'll go in the world and if coming back to Vermont makes sense to him if he goes away. But, again, we'll always be connected by the mycelia. So, even if we're not buried side by side, we'll always be together in some way. But I mean, I hope in a lot of ways that I'm forgotten. And I think that my hope someday is that people just come to this space and say it's so beautiful and that everybody that's buried there is a part of what makes it beautiful, even if you don't know who they are. But my hope is that, again, you'll just be able to walk around the story and say, well, is that a grave? Is that was somebody buried there? I mean, people have markers sometimes, but and just say, oh, and they pull up their map and they say, oh, here's a story. And I think, oh gosh, that person was really interesting, right? And they just keep walking. I mean, that's what's better than that.
Uh, Really nothing. I mean, you said it beautifully, and I think that's the legacy that that will be. And for those watching this, you know, it's so true. For people who've been doing this for a lot of the right reasons, educating and trying to inspire others. There's this opportunity within every community across our country, and that the true goal is for every community to be able to share a space like this. And you guys have done some wonderful work up there. You know, I love the idea that you've said and you've stated that this isn't about yourself, your name. It's about the place, and it there will be many others, but you guys just always remember, and I know you know this, your legacy will be that you were the ones doing, you did some heavy lifting. You created that first space, and not that you need to be recognized, but that is a big accomplishment. And the reward will be someday in the future having these spaces throughout the entire state. That is what you've accomplished. So I really appreciate you coming on today, Michelle. It was a wonderful time. I'm sure the viewers are going to love it. Viewers, you can learn more by visiting cemetery.eco.
Yep,
Uh,
all E's.
and support your local cemetery. Support people like Michelle. Visit with Michelle if you can. I know I'd like to come up and take
Yeah,
a peek at
let's
what
do
you've
it.
done. It sounds beautiful, and yeah, if you have any events or anything that you're doing in the future, share it with us, and we'll share it with our community, and we'll show you our support.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we do screenings of the documentary. We give tours May through November. There's, the concerts and labyrinth walks. There's all sorts of things going on. So, and we do private tours as well. So, we'd love to see anybody. You should come up. You're not far when you come to visit Vermont. So just take a little detour, come see us.
No,
We
well,
are
I
open in
plan
the
on
winter.
doing it. Well, it's beautiful any time of year for me, but some people can't take the cold, so maybe they come up in the spring and summer, but it
Yep.
sure is beautiful in the wintertime. Well, thank you, Michelle.
All
It
right.
was a pleasure. And this is Ed Bixby from the Global Green Burial Alliance, and this was Spotlight Now.